Hey, Modern World History students. We are winding down Unit 10, 20th and 21st Century Nationalism. And again, when you're talking about nationalism, the question always is, who should rule our society, us or outsiders? And we've really been focusing on that question in the region called Palestine, and the way that that question has caused eruption of conflict and violence between Arabs and Israelis. But by the mid 1990s, it seemed like a lot of that conflict and violence was starting to wind down. There had been peace agreements established between Israel and Arab states like Egypt and Jordan, and there had even been peace agreements established between Israel and the Palestinian people themselves. And the way that those agreements kind of worked out was that the Palestinians, formerly the PLO, Palestine Liberation Organization, had agreed to recognize Israel's right to exist and had also agreed to stop carrying out terrorist activities against the Israelis. And then in return, Israel had granted the Palestinians what's called self rule in areas that had been occupied by Israel during the 6 Years' War. So, for example, in the area of the West Bank and in the area of Gaza, the Israelis had granted to the Palestinians self rule. They could elect their own local governments and they could create their own laws and they could police themselves. So, by the mid 1990s, it seemed like there was the real likelihood of a lasting peace between Israel and the Palestinians and their Arab neighbors. It seemed like we were even on the path toward a solution in which the Palestinians would have their own self governing state, no longer be part of Israel at all, but become independent from Israel. So, not just self governing within Israel, but actually an independent and self governing state. That's the direction that things seem to be moving by the late 1990s. But that's no longer the case. And the reason why that's no longer the case is because of people who are called extremists. And if you want to understand who extremists are, think of it this way: extremists are people who are not willing to accept anything less than 100% of what they want, right? So they would rather burn down the whole world than take 99% of what they want. Okay? You cannot make a deal with extremists. Extremists are not willing to compromise. They're not willing to back down on any part of what they think they deserve. They demand 100% of what they want, or they would rather destroy everything. And the problem is that there are extremists in Palestine. You have extremists on the side of the Israelis, and you have extremists on the side of the Palestinians. And neither of them were happy about the peace agreements that were achieved in the 1990s, because those peace agreements were based upon compromise. And these extremists don't like compromise because compromise means they don't get 100% of what they want. So let's talk about that a little bit. So we're up at the top of page 25. And first, we're going to talk about Israeli extremists. So the Prime Minister of Israel, um, Itzhak Rabin, Rabin, was the one who had negotiated the two peace agreements with the Palestinians. The first peace agreement with the Palestinians, called the Oslo Accords, which gave the Palestinians self rule, limited self rule. And then he negotiated the peace agreement with Jordan, in which Jordan gave up its claims on the West Bank in exchange for full Palestinian self rule there. So Itzhak Rabin was the prime minister of Israel who had signed those peace agreements, historic peace agreements. However, there are some Israeli extremists, who believe that no part of Palestine should be conceded to the Arabs. No part. They would argue that the modern state of Israel should have the same borders, the same political boundaries as the ancient kingdom of Israel from the Bible. And the ancient kingdom of Israel took up all of Palestine. All of Palestine was part of the ancient kingdom of Israel. So Israeli extremists would say that no part of Palestine should be governed by the Arabs, Palestinian Arabs or the other Arab states. So if you're an Israeli extremist, you hate the deal. You hate the deal that Itzhak Rabin made with the Palestinians to allow them self-rule in the West Bank and in Gaza. You hate that, and you hate the fact that that appears to be directing toward eventually the Palestinians having their own independent self-governing state there. So Israeli extremists were quite opposed. And as a matter of fact, one of them murdered Prime Minister Itzhak Rabin. So, despite being surrounded by the enemy, in all of Israel's history, they had never had a prime minister assassinated. They had never lost a major government leader. Their secret service, their protective service, the Mossad, had never lost a major government leader to assassination. But Itzhak Rabin, the prime minister, was assassinated. The reason why the Mossad did not see it coming, the reason why they got beat on this one was they had always expected that the threat would come from an Arab. But in this case, it came from a Jew. It came from an Israeli extremist, right? An extremist Jew in Israel who was unhappy about Rabin's peace process that he had entered into with the Palestinians. So you see that being a peacemaker in this part of the world is very dangerous. You saw how the president of Egypt, Anwar Sadat, was murdered by one of his own people for making a deal with Israel. Here we see Prime Minister Itzhak Rabin murdered, assassinated for making a deal with the Palestinians. Now, on the other hand, if you're an extremist Palestinian, extremist Arab, you do not believe that Israel should exist at all, right? So extremist Israelis do not believe that any part of Palestine should be governed by Arabs, that all of Palestine must be part of Israel. Extremist Arabs, or extremist Palestinians in particular, they believe that Israel should not exist. And so for them, the fact that the Palestinian leadership, the fact that the PLO gave up the goal of eliminating Israel, the fact that the Arab states, including Egypt and Jordan, gave up the goal of eliminating Israel, they thought that was horrible, right? So think about the extremists in Egypt who assassinated Anwar Sadat because, as part of his deal with Israel in the Camp David Accords, he recognized Israel's right to exist. So if you're an extremist Arab, you don't believe any Arab should recognize Israel's right to exist, including the Palestinians, the leadership of the Palestinian Authority. So when the PLO removed from its charter as part of the peace deal, the Oslo Accords in 1993, when they removed from their charter the goal of eliminating Israel, of ending Israel, Palestinian extremists basically split off from the PLO, split off from the Palestinian Authority, and they formed extremist groups to continue the armed struggle, the terrorist struggle against Israel. The most important of those extremist groups, and there are several extremist groups that are determined to continue the goal of destroying Israel and using terrorism to do it, armed conflict to do it. The most important of those is called Hamas. There are others, but the most important is called Hamas. And as you can see, they're openly militant, openly violent in the nature of what they're trying to do. And what they did that was not successful. What they did that was not successful was also take part in the politics of the Palestinian Authority. So when the Palestinian Authority was free to elect its own parliament and its own president, Hamas basically they ran candidates. So not only were they trying to take the fight to Israel still through violent armed conflict and terrorism, but they hoped also to take control of the Palestinian Authority itself and steer the Palestinian leadership back toward the goal of destroying Israel. However, when the Palestinian people had their opportunity to vote for the Palestinian Authority Parliament and to vote for its president, they largely rejected Hamas. Uh, Basically, Hamas got very few seats in the Palestinian parliament, and for president, the Palestinian voters elected the man on the left, whose name was Mahmoud Abbas. Mahmoud Abbas was certainly a person who had engaged in armed struggle against Israel, and at times had even been captured and imprisoned in an Israeli jail. Um, but Mahmoud Abbas, but the thing is, you could say that about all the Palestinian leadership, Yasser Arafat and the rest. They at one time had been engaged in armed struggle against Israel. However, Mahmoud Abbas, like Yasser Arafat, had come around to the side of moderation. He had come around to the side of the goal of coexisting with Israel. Mahmoud Abbas's goal was to achieve a independent, self-governing state for the Palestinians, and he knew that the only way that that was going to happen is by making a deal with Israel and by continuing to make deals with Israel and by demonstrating to Israel that the Palestinian Authority really could govern the Palestinians and really could secure Israel against violence from the Palestinians. So, so it was a very clear choice for Palestinian voters when they had the opportunity in the late 1990s. They could vote for Abbas and for the sort of mainstream members of the Palestinian Authority, or they could vote for the Hamas leadership. If they voted for Abbas, that would mean they approved of this more moderate peacemaking process that would lead to two states coexisting peacefully, a Palestinian state and Israel, or they could vote for, um, Hamas and go back to the old ways of hostility toward Israel and trying to destroy Israel and using terrorism against them. And when they had their choice, the Palestinian voters overwhelmingly chose the path of moderation. They elected Abbas to be the president. They largely rejected the Hamas candidates for the parliament, and so that again gave reason to believe that that there could be this permanent settlement with two independent, self-governing states living side by side in peace. The Palestinian Authority police, who you see here on the right, seem to be able to handle law enforcement within the West Bank and within Gaza. There weren't terrorist attacks against Israel. Things seem to be going well. However, Hamas and the other extremists found a way to ruin it. And here's how they did it. Moving you to the bottom of page 25. Starting in the year 2000, Hamas and the other extremists waged what became known as the Second Intifada. Um, Remember that intifada in Arabic simply really means struggle or rebellion, armed struggle, armed rebellion. But in the first intifada, remember it was kids, right? It was these sort of teenage and 20-something kids who would go out into the streets and they would sort of provoke Israeli police by throwing rocks at them and parts of bricks and things. And then the Israelis would sort of fire back at them with tear gas or rubber bullets. And when those images were televised, it made Israel look bad, and it helped to turn world public opinion against Israel and in favor of some sort of self-governing for for the Palestinians. And that's part of what produced those peace agreements between Israel and the Palestinians in the mid 1990s. The Second Intifada was different. In the Second Intifada, um, what happened was um, extremists, Palestinian extremists, would basically strap explosives to their bodies. Okay, they would strap, high explosive bombs to their bodies, cover up with some sort of coat or jacket, and then they would board a bus in Israel, or they would walk into a fast food restaurant or a pizza place or a nightclub or a bar in Israel, and they'd blow themselves up. They would detonate the bomb. They would blow themselves up. So they were suicide bombers. martyrs, as other fellow extremists called them, martyrs, people who die for their cause. Um, but they were suicide bombers, and when they blew themselves up, of course, if you board a crowded bus in Israel at rush hour when people are trying to go to work or come home from work, and you blow yourself up, you'll blow up the entire bus, and you'll kill all the people, all the Israelis in the bus with you. um, or if you walk into a crowded fast food place at lunchtime, or a pizza place at lunchtime, or if you go into a club at nighttime and blow yourself up, you'll kill dozens of Israelis, and you'll injure probably dozens more, maybe hundreds more. And that was exactly what these these martyrs, these suicide bombers, had in mind. So the Second Intifada was not like the First Intifada. The First Intifada was meant to provoke action from Israeli police that would then be replayed on television and turn public opinion against Israel. But it was low casualties, right? There was not an attempt to inflict a lot of casualties against Israeli civilians. These attacks, starting in the early 2000s, were mass casualty attacks. The suicide bombers, the so-called martyrs of Hamas and the other Palestinian extremist groups, they were deliberately and you know and with full calculation, they were trying to kill as many Israeli civilians as they could in these attacks, and they were very successful. And there were dozens of these attacks. It was almost like day after day, and the purpose here was to try to provoke Israel into a response, and also it was to try to provoke the Israeli population, because you could see by the support for Itzhak Rabin, other than the extremists, you could see by the support for Itzhak Rabin as Israeli prime minister that the Israelis overall, they wanted this peaceful solution. They wanted to believe that in the future you could have two independent self-governing states living side by side peacefully. It's clear that the majority of Palestinians wanted that as well because of their support for Mahmoud Abbas and the moderates in the Palestinian Authority. But what Hamas and the extremists were trying to do is they were trying to provoke anger. They were trying to make the Israeli civilian population stop supporting the peace process, stop believing in a two-state solution where Israelis and Palestinians could live together side by side in peace. The hope was, if you were a member of Hamas or one of these Palestinian extremist groups, was that Israelis would be so outraged by the violence being carried out against them by these terrorists, these suicide bombers, that they would turn against the peace process. They would elect a government that was opposed to making peace with the Palestinians. Because remember, Palestinian extremists, they don't want peace. They don't want peace with Israel. Peace with Israel is not their result. They want the destruction of Israel. So they were hoping to provoke the Israeli voters to elect a government that would be back at war with the Palestinians and not seeking peaceful relations with them. And at first, the Israelis didn't take the bait. At first, the Israeli voters continued to support government. They knew what was going on. They sort of understood what the terrorists, the suicide bombers, were trying to do. And at first, they didn't take the bait. They continued to support Israeli governments that were going to try to make peace. But you can only put up with this for so long. You can only live in fear for so long. You can only deal with these suicide bombings day after day for so long. And eventually, Israeli voters did what the Palestinian extremists hoped they would do. They elected a government, they elected a leadership that was determined to punish the Palestinians and retaliate for these attacks. So the Prime Minister of Israel in the early 2000s, who was elected basically specifically for the purpose of punishing the Palestinians and retaliating for these attacks, was Ariel Sharon. And Ariel Sharon, the man you see in the picture there, Prime Minister of Israel, he was a former Israeli Defense Forces paratrooper, special forces. He was a man who had been taking the fight to the Arabs all his life, and he believed that that the suicide bombings deserved a military response. He believed that the Palestinian Authority was not doing all that it could to stop the suicide bombings from happening. And so his argument was that if the Palestinian Authority cannot or will not retaliate or suppress these extremists, these terrorists, these suicide bombers, then Israel will have to. And so now, every time there was a suicide bombing in Israel, Israel would then carry out some sort of retaliatory strike in Gaza or in West Bank. So those were the two regions of Palestine that were now under Palestinian self-government, Gaza and the West Bank. So now, whenever there was a suicide bombing, Sharon would order the Israeli military to carry out an airstrike, usually helicopters or jets launching missiles or bombing a site in Palestinian-controlled West Bank or Palestinian-controlled Gaza. And for what it's worth, the Israelis did target structures which were known by the Israelis because they have excellent spies and informants. The Israelis were trying to target structures that were known to be the living spaces of leaders of these extremist groups, Hamas leaders, or leaders of some of the other martyrs groups, these terrorist groups, these extremist groups that were carrying out terrorist acts, suicide bombings in Israel. The problem with that is this. Okay, you've identified an apartment building, and you know that this or that leader of Hamas or this or that leader of the Al-Aqsa martyrs, they live in this apartment building. Perhaps they even have their headquarters in this apartment building. So Israeli helicopters obliterate the apartment building. They hit it with missiles, they hit it with bombs, whatever it is. Well, of course, inevitably what happens then is, who else is killed? Innocents, right? It's an apartment building. There are civilians living in that apartment building who are not active in Hamas. They're not suicide bombers. They're not martyrs, but they are killed too when the building explodes or when the building collapses. And so the Israelis might get some of the Hamas leaders or some of the other extremist leaders with their airstrikes, but you'd get maybe 6 Hamas people, and there would then be a few dozen innocents who are also killed. And that's exactly what the extremists wanted. That's exactly what the martyrs wanted. They were trying to provoke Israel to do this because by launching suicide bomber attacks against Israel, they turned Israelis against the peace process. They turned Israelis against the idea of having permanent peace with the Palestinians. But by also provoking the Israelis to retaliate, when the Israelis retaliated, the deaths of innocent Palestinians now were turning Palestinians against the peace process. And that is exactly what the extremists, the Palestinian extremists, were trying to achieve. That's exactly what Hamas was trying to achieve, to turn both the Israelis and the Palestinians against the peace process and against the idea that the two sides could live together in sort of harmony, right, and in peace. So in 2006, after all of this, it was time for another. Election in the Palestinian Authority, another parliamentary election, and another presidential election. And so now Hamas felt very, very good that they might actually be able to take control of the Palestinian Authority because more and more Palestinians were turning against the peace process. More and more Palestinians were siding with the extremists against moderates like Mahmoud Abbas. Well, in the 2006 parliamentary elections in Palestine, you got a split result. The candidates from Hamas, they actually gained a majority in the Palestinian parliament, but the moderate Mahmoud Abbas was reelected president. So as a result of that split decision, there was a period of about 2 weeks of civil war, basically, among Palestinians. Palestinians now killing each other, fighting it out over who should lead them. And the result of that civil war was also a split decision. In the area of Gaza, which is this highly urbanized, densely populated area here on the coast, in the area of Gaza, Hamas won. They won the Palestinian civil war in Gaza, and they took control of the Palestinian Authority government there. In the West Bank, the moderates won, and they kept control of the Palestinian government there. So, and it's been that way ever since. So, for 16 years now, the Palestinians have been divided. In Gaza, they live under the more radical extremist leadership of Hamas, and in the West Bank, they live under the more moderate leadership of the Palestinian Authority led by Mahmoud Abbas. Um, Not surprisingly, there has been hostility and violence between Gaza and Israel, since Gaza is governed by the extremist Hamas. As a matter of fact, last year, 2021, there was a pretty intense exchange of fighting, missiles and bombings between the two sides. In fact, 4 times since 2006, there have been those kinds of violent exchanges. But then on the other hand, the relationship between Israel and the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank is pretty reasonable. So you can see how we were so close. I'm telling you that, say, if you looked at this in the year 2000, you would have said, wow, that there really is going to be a permanent solution between Israel and the Palestinians. There really are going to be, two states, an Israel and a Palestinian state, independent of each other, but peacefully coexisting. But these extremists, particularly the Palestinian extremists of Hamas, figured out how to ruin that, and there still hasn't been a solution. So, kind of a sobering lesson there. Well, take care. That's it for now. Take care, modern world history students. We'll talk to you again soon. Bye bye.